Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, Israeli conservatives are projected to win in parliamentary elections. We ask, where's the country's left? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here bringing in all your live interaction. Malika, exit polls are projecting the re-election of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his conservative coalition. And some of our folks on Twitter are saying, the more conservative Israel becomes, the more isolated it also becomes from the rest of the world.
A vicious cycle. And Lisa, we have a video commenter saying just that, and I'm going to play that a little bit later in the show. But for now, we're monitoring the hashtag Israel Votes. I pulled this up on my screen, and this is Israeli voters sharing their election day pictures on Instagram, posting themselves at the ballots.
Those are cool.
Very cool. Yeah. So for those of you at home, feel free to share your pictures with us as well. Just make sure you tag them at AJ Stream.
All right, to Malika's right is Hillary Krieger. She's the Washington bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post, where she writes about U.S. policies on Israel. Hillary, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We'd also like to welcome a number of Israeli bloggers and activists. They are joining us via Google Plus Hangout and will be part of our discussion. Now, for those of you at home or online interested in joining us live, just go to that link you see at the bottom of the screen and add us to your circles.
Hi, my name is Adil Zaid. I'm from Pakistan. News which you don't find on mainstream, you will find on the stream. And therefore, I'm in the stream.
After a short election campaign, Israelis have cast their votes to select a new government. Many of the opinion polls leading up to the parliamentary elections suggest a win for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which is likely to bring along a new conservative coalition government. And if early predictions are an accurate reflection of voting trends, Israel will not only solidify its political right wing, but also reinforce religious voices in the Knesset. According to the head of research at the Israel Democracy Institute, religious and ultra-Orthodox Jews and settlers in the West Bank are expected to win a significant presence in the country's 19th Knesset. In fact, it's estimated that 1 of every 6 representatives will be West Bank settlers. So, in an election projected to move Israel further to the right, where's the country's left? What happened to the large protests that dominated the summer of 2011, demanding solutions for the country's rising cost of living and pushing back against increasing financial burdens on the middle class? Hundreds of thousands of Israelis came out in support of the social protest movement, also known as J14. And many thought the movement was shaping up to be an Israeli spring. So did this spring simply fail to gain momentum, or are there other factors behind the rise of the political right? To help us answer these questions, we're also joined via Skype from Tel Aviv by Ilan Manur, a blogger who writes about Israeli politics and the portrayal of Israeli society in mass media. Over the phone is Budur Hussan, a Palestinian blogger with Israeli citizenship living in Jerusalem. Ilan, Budur, welcome to the stream.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So, Hillary, I want to start with you. You've got this reinforced conservative coalition with Prime Minister Netanyahu expected to win. If the country is truly moving to the right, let's answer that first question we posed. What happened to the left, and what happened to this social justice movement of 2011?
Well, first of all, I think it's important just to note that when you talk about a move to the right, it's almost entirely within the already established right-wing part of the Israeli spectrum. So the right, with Netanyahu as the prime minister, has already been the controlling force in the society. And the issue is that the people who are part of those different coalition blocks within the right have moved even more to the right. But the people who are in the center and the left have essentially stayed where they are. So you still do have a center and a left. The problem is that they're quite fractured and that they haven't been able to really galvanize behind one leader who could really challenge Netanyahu. So even though there's disaffection with Netanyahu, there hasn't been a really forceful voice. So you've had these social protests that really tapped into something within the Israeli society, frustration that the middle class students were not able to really buy apartments or live a comfortable lifestyle, even with all of their hard work, because of a really soaring cost of living. This tapped into frustration that the government has not been answering, and that did have an effect in terms of bringing people and parties to really focus on economic issues. It's just that the fractured nature of that movement.
Yeah, here are some pictures we're looking at too while you're talking.
hasn't-
These are from the 2011 protest.
It hasn't been enough to change that overall dynamic. Though we are seeing a lot of people coming to the polls who do say they support the center left, so we'll not know exactly until we get the final count later on today.
Ilan, I can't help think about some comparisons to the Occupy Wall Street movement here in the U.S. It took off with such force and then it just sort of fizzled away. Do you see any connections between the two?
Well, I think that there is a certain degree of similarity. I think that in the summer of 2011, a lot of Israelis felt that we are witnessing a true shift in the priorities of the Israeli working middle class. That this class was no longer interested only in the fate of the occupied territories, but also in making ends meet and being able to afford universities and buying apartments. But I think that as we witness the results of these elections, I think that the protest eventually had a very small, if any, effect on the elections themselves. And there are three main signals for this. First, the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu, who at the height of the protests was labeled as the friend of big business, an accomplice to the tycoons, and was urged to resign, and he has regained a lot of popularity. Second, the Labour Party, who is the only one to run on the social ticket and has been losing votes for several weeks now. And finally, the Jewish Home Party, which is a right-wing party who has been soaring in popularity, and they did not highlight any social issues, but only issues relating to the future of the West Bank and the Jewish nature of the State of Israel.
Yeah, and we want to
So
get to the
I-
Jewish Home Party in a little,
Just
little
a
bit
minute.
for sure.
Exactly.
yeah.
But what I thought was interesting, he mentioned true shift. Members of our community are saying they don't agree. Akash on Twitter says Netanyahu projected to win implies protesters didn't appeal to the masses. And one more from Neslihan who says Israeli elections are about serving the needs of mainstream voters who aren't comfortable with any drastic changes and policies. And I want to pose that to Igal Rambam, who's in our Google Plus Hangout. And Igal, of course, was a housing protest leader. Igal, were the housing protests a success?
It's hi, good evening. It's a success in the meaning that people started to speak about issues of economy and social justice. It is a bit difficult these days in Israel to do a very big shift, a very big step into understanding that it should. The bigger question is either Israel is going to be only a Jewish nation or the state of all its citizens. It's part of it. So it takes time. I think we won't see the change in these elections. We will see a reactionary reaction to the masses, to the hundreds of thousands of Israelis went out to the streets. We couldn't organize in a period of 100 days that we had to these elections. It's a success of awareness, but there are no results that you can actually feel in the change of the regime. Maybe we'll see some kind of merits. Maybe will be stronger in the end of this day, or Hadash, which is a party of Jews and Arabs. Let's see. It's yes.
Ilan, Yigal is talking about a success of awareness, but it hasn't translated to anything tangible in the election. If there was one single mistake that you think J14 made, what was it?
Well, I think that one of the major problems was that the protests were attended in the beginning by thousands and then hundreds of thousands of Israelis from both sides of the political spectrum. And given their desire to maintain the popularity of the protests, the leaders spoke about the problems but not about the solutions. They talked about the high cost of living. They talked about the need to reallocate the national budget. They talked about the need to set new priorities, but they didn't say what the priorities are. They didn't say where the new money for a new welfare state would come from. And obviously, to some extent, it would have to come from the settlements and from the security establishment, which represents a major bulk of our national budget. So by labeling the protests non-political ones, they might have enabled politicians to marginalize the protest.
Let's go to Elizabeth in our Google Plus Hangout. Elizabeth Surkov is an Israeli blogger and human rights activist. Do you think that the J14 protests are going to have any effect at all in these elections?
I think they're already having an effect. The fact that so many people are voting and voting in areas that are traditionally lean to the left and where people traditionally kind of stayed out of the polls in previous elections, and they pretty much gave up on changing anything. The fact that people are now coming to the polls, the fact that people are much more energized now, and the fact that these elections are not just about Iran or Palestinians or security or having a strong Israel, they're also about economic issues, and people do take that into account when they cast their ballot, and this wasn't the case in the past. I think the problem with the J14 movement was not exactly that it wasn't political. The problem was the Israeli left and the Israeli center left, which is very, very fractured, and it couldn't kind of form a cohesive party that would represent what J14 was about, because the Labour Party has very kind of similar ideas to J14, also in the sense that it's kind of refuses to talk about the occupation. But there are two other parties, two other large parties in the Israeli center-left that are kind of out there, and their stances on politics are not that different from one another, and just because of ego issues and lack of leadership, the bloc is very fractured, and it's much easier to defeat it that way.
Hillary, Elizabeth's talking about there has been an effect from the social protest movement. A lot of people are out voting, but the truth is a lot of these young people that are out voting are young secular people who are voting for the Likud party, who are trending conservative. What's your explanation for that?
Well, I think that
Trending more conservative, I should say.
Right. Well, I think a lot of the people that the social protest movement has spoken to a lot of people, but there are, first of all, some people who think that the Israeli economy has done incredibly well overall over the past decade or so, and that's part of the problem. There's this very strong economy, which means things are getting more expensive and it's harder for people on the one hand, but it also means Israel's doing well for certain people, and certain people do believe that Netanyahu's free market policies are correct. You also have people, though, who feel very disenchanted with the possibility that you'd have any sort of peace deal with the Palestinians, who think
young
that that's
people who
just
grew up in Tel Aviv watching
Right.
nothing change over the last 20 or 30 years?
Well, first of all, they watched their friends getting blown up on buses and cafes, and they had a much, I think, a harder and less hopeful experience than the generation before that was very involved with Oslo. And now, when it seems that there's just been no progress recently, and the numbers show fewer and fewer Israelis and Palestinians thinking a two-state solution is a possibility, then turning towards the right, turning towards parties that emphasize security, that emphasize other values, can appeal to some of those people, especially some of the people are secular, some are also the growing ultra-Orthodox and the growing Orthodox who have higher birth rates, and those are a lot of the young people too, are already in that right part of the spectrum.
I want to get back to something that Ilan mentioned earlier, and it's one of the biggest election stories out of Israel. Right now, it's the popularity of this Jewish Home Party. Its young and charismatic leaders have played off religious nationalist fervor, and they're using that to really push their far-right message. Here's a clip from one of their campaign ads.
The Bayit Yehudi's platform includes the economy, lowering housing prices, service for all, women's rights and education, the entire spectrum of national issues. But what's captivating the country is that the Bayit Yehudi represents what we've all been waiting for, a return to values-based Zionism. For more than 20 years, Israel has made painful concessions with the hopes that by giving away land, by freezing buildings, by destroying Jewish neighborhoods, we would achieve peace with our neighbors. It's time to reclaim our right to be a free people in our homeland. It's time for Jewish pride in an empowered Jewish identity.
Liel Leibovitz, in our Google Hangout, senior writer for Tablet Magazine. Why do you think the Jewish Home Party became so popular, even among young secular Israelis?
Well, I think there are two explanations. The first is sort of skin deep. The party is headed by a guy named Naftali Bennett, and I think he's very much the kind of guy that Israelis like to imagine themselves as being when they look in the mirror. He's traditionally, a religious Zionist. He is a former commander in the army. He is also a high-tech startup CEO who's made $135 million selling his company to an American corporation. So he's sort of a representation, or almost too perfect representation, of both the past and future. But I think there's also a deeper explanation to this. I think one of the reasons this party is so appealing to people, and according to some recent polls I've seen, that 43% of its electorate are secular Israelis, is because it represents something that mainstream political Zionist parties like Labor and Likud simply no longer can offer, which is good old-fashioned ideology. You know, sort of Zionism is felt by a lot of Israelis to have kind of played its part. It's established a state that has built, a proud, strong nation. And here comes Naftali Bennett and says, hey guys, hold on. Our mission is not yet accomplished. Our job is not yet done. There's still a great big project to be proud of, which is a religious project, which is, by some interpretations, a messianic project, which is based heavily on the establishment of settlements, which gives a tremendous sense of pride and belonging. And it's much sexier and much more appealing than anything else going on.
Well, Elon, we're asking our community members why young seculars are more attracted to parties like this rather than protest movements like J14 or the left. Francois on Twitter says Israel's left has been unable to be united. And we also have a video comment from someone who has an opinion. Have a listen.
Well, I remember already in '96, I was only 10 years old, and I remember Bibi was considered bad for Israel back then. And I saw history repeat itself the last 4 years, and I really hope we don't see it again. I think that there is a strong left in Israel. We see it already in the high numbers of voting in the left areas, the left parties, and I really hope that we see a stronger left, a more efficient left in Israel.
So, Elon, he hopes for a more efficient left, but is that substantiated?
The last exit polls that were shown on Friday did show a certain decrease in the gap between the left wing and the right wing, especially if you take out the religious parties who tend to give their support to the highest bidder. But I think that at the end of the day, Netanyahu is going to form the next government, and he is going to have a right-wing conservative majority. And you talked about the Jewish Home Party. They are definitely the trendy party in this election. Young Israeli voters like trendy parties. And I think that the fact that they are voting for this party is, like your previous commenter said, due to Naftali Bennett, the leader. And this represents a sort of Americanization of Israeli politics. People vote for a person, they don't vote for a party. They don't know what the party stands for, they know what the person stands for.
Yeah, Elon, some have argued that J14 actually saved the Labor Party.
Well, it's an interesting question because, like I said, Labor has been running on the social ticket, but they have been losing votes for several weeks right now. It's also the only party to incorporate people who were identified with the social protest into its list of candidates for the Knesset, but this hasn't brought a large turnout of votes. So I'm not sure that protest really saved the left. I think that the Israeli left, to some degree, is still a bit dazed and confused and still hasn't found its voice yet again.
Left dazed and confused, Hillary?
Well, definitely in the sense that even within the left, you've seen so much division that you couldn't come behind one leader that could really challenge Netanyahu. I think, though, that the Labour Party has been effective in terms of taking advantage of the economic issues. You've seen Labour likely going to be the #2 party in the next Knesset. It's supposed to pick up seats, and I think that that's partly because it is harnessing these economic issues. I think the problem that it faces is actually largely because that's all it's been able to focus on. So while you do have voters that for the first time are really embracing that as their central issue, it's still not enough because the leadership won't ever talk about issues like Iran that are still going to be very much pressing issues for the next prime minister. Sheli Yakimovich, the leader, doesn't have any experience in diplomacy or military and just doesn't seem like a credible leader on those issues, which still at the end of the day are something that you need to have some ability in if you're going to be able to lead a country like Israel in the environment that it's in.
I want to shift gears a little bit here because when it comes to the role of Palestinians in this Israeli election, there are a group of Israel activists who've launched a Facebook campaign. It's called Real Democracy, and it's urging Israelis to give their votes to Palestinians in protest of what they say is an unfair electoral system. Here's the group's organizer to explain.
This is a project of Israelis and Palestinians who protest the lack of real democracy in Israel and in the UN system. The idea is that Israelis give their votes to Palestinians, essentially letting a Palestinian decide what they do on elections day to protest the lack of democracy.
Budur Hassan in our Google Plus Hangout, you're a Palestinian blogger, so I want to pose this to you. First of all, as a Palestinian, how do you feel about this initiative? And then also follow up with your general thoughts on this election.
Initiative, I don't think it's going to change anything. It's just symbolic. It's a nice initiative from the Israeli radical left to be in solidarity with Palestinians who are deprived, who are ruled by Israel militarily, but they are deprived of the right to vote, while the nearby people in the settlements in the occupied West Bank can vote. But my opinion regarding the elections, I boycotted the elections out of ideological reasons, because I can't believe that you can dismantle the master's house through using the master's tools. I don't think, and you've talked a lot about Israeli right and Israeli left, I don't think there is such a great difference between the Zionist right and the Zionist left or the Zionist center left. At the end of the day, we remember when the Kafr Qasim massacre happened, the party that ruled Israel was supposedly leftist. When the mass confiscation of land happened in the start of the 70s, the party that ruled was leftist. Israel's most vicious wars and crimes were committed by supposedly leftist parties. And the party that repressed Palestinians in 2000 at the start of the Second Intifada was also leftist. So I think the difference between Zionist right and Zionist left is ultimately symbolic, ultimately rhetorical, and this is why, as opposed to Jewish Israelis, the turnout among Palestinians in Israel has been very low.
Okay, but Budur, listen, the Palestinians, they were urged to vote. They were urged to have a voice in this process. And you're saying you don't vote, you're never going to vote, you wouldn't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. How do you change things then? I mean, the social protest movement, which involved hundreds of thousands of Israelis, hasn't had an impact on this election. That was grassroots. How do you go about changing the system?
And indeed, in that was grassroots, but was organized mainly by Israelis. It addressed only issues of the Zionist middle class. It didn't address issues like the demolitions in the Naqab or the situation of Palestinian villages. And even when it did address them, it was very shy, and it was like ignoring the elephant that was in the side. I think the main solution for us Palestinians is to start working on the ground, to re-establish the High Popular Committee for Palestinian Israel, and to try to connect our struggles with the struggles of Palestinians in the West Bank, with the struggle of Palestinian refugees. I think, and even if I was not ideologically opposed to elections, I think unfortunately the Palestinian parties in the Knesset, the three major Palestinian parties, have major failures in this Knesset. They ignored many important issues. They ignored issues like the right of return of Palestinian refugees. They ignored gender-related issues. And unfortunately, some of the parties supported the Assad regime. So I think the Palestinian parties have failed in convincing Palestinian population that they should vote for them. And this explains the very low turnout rate, because it's not that Palestinians in Israel are apathetic. They want change, and they want to see change happening.
Okay, Budur, I'm going to stop you there. Ilan, we've got about a minute left in the show. I want you to look into the crystal ball and give us your sense of what's going to happen here.
Well, I think it's going to be a bit closer than what people originally expected. I think we're going to see a smaller gap, but it's possible that this is just hopeful optimism and not something real. What we are witnessing definitely is the rise of a new right wing, more radical right wing, more hateful right wing, I think, to a certain degree.
All right, Ilan, I'm going to stop you there. I'd like everybody to stay with us. The post show is coming up next. It's streamed at aljazeera.com. Now, on tomorrow's program, is it okay to be single after 27? In some cultures, it's taboo, but in China and India and, of course, the U.S., more women are choosing to pursue their own future. So send us your thoughts and your questions and comments on that. And until then, we'll see you online. Welcome back to the Online Post Show. We're going to pick up where we left off. We're talking about the Israeli elections today. One of our members of the Google Hangout, a Palestinian blogger, was just talking about a Facebook campaign where Israelis were essentially giving their vote to Palestinians to give Palestinians a greater voice in this election. And Malika and I were just saying, real curious to see what Israelis think about all that.
Exactly. And before I get an Israeli point of view in our Hangout, I wanted to read a couple of tweets here from people that were agreeing with Badur, of course. Free Thinking Kenyan says, vis-a-vis the Palestine issue, it doesn't matter who's in power. They've all been in power before and done zilch. And another from Limam who says, sure, is Netanyahu for a third time, but the question is he going to stop the settlements and guide Israel and Palestine to peace? Now, Igal Rambam, speaking to you again in our Google Plus Hangout, I want your thoughts on those tweets, but also your thoughts on what Badur said at the end of our main show, in which she had a couple of criticisms for the reform movement and saying that they didn't really reach across the aisle to Palestinians and address some of the issues that Palestinians are dealing with. As a protest leader, how would you respond to that?
What we tried to do at the last summer, the 10th protest, is to reach as many Israelis as possible. We did try to avoid the conflict of Israel and Palestine and the Palestinians, which is a very deep question inside Israel. I do think us as left-wingers, as activists, we need to form sort of a committee that allows people, Israelis, Jews and Palestinians, to try to reach to some understandings. And us as part of, I think, as a global change, which is, I think, all of the world, either also North America and Europe and the Mediterranean and the Arab Spring, we want some different kind of regime, different kind of democracy. We're part of a greater change. It will take time. I know, I do accept the critic Badur did here in the program, but it will take time, and we do try to fix it and to go deeper inside Israeli society and to talk with people, to change.
Hillary, the Central Election Commission had a huge Get Out the Vote campaign. What role did voter apathy play in this election?
Well, you know, it's interesting. During the campaign, people were really not so focused on it. They felt that the outcome was a foregone conclusion. It's basically going to be keeping the status quo. You didn't see real deep substantive debate of a lot of important issues. However, right now the turnout has been really high. I mean, there was talk, at least at some points in the day, of it even being a record. Even actually a strong number of Arab Israelis turning out, which is unusual.
Last I saw was over 55%.
Right. So, and that was the highest it had been at that point in the day, you know, in a long time. So the Israeli population is clearly active and engaged in this election, and you know, moved by the issues that we've been discussing now. Whether that's actually going to mean that you're going to see a different type of coalition is less clear. I think there's a good chance that Netanyahu is going to have to, or want to, try to reach out to include at least one of the center-left parties. Though you've already seen that because you've had Defense Minister Ehud Barak, who's from Labor originally, as part of the coalition until now. So that's not such a change, but Netanyahu might feel even more pressure internally to try and have at least some of those voices be part of his coalition.
Ilan, picking up on what Hillary said, wouldn't it be easier, though, for Netanyahu to just stay narrowly focused with ultra-conservatives and the religious right, rather than involve these centrist coalitions that could ultimately bring things to an impasse? Because all of a sudden you've got a lot of different ideologies at the table, and he's got to satisfy a lot of different types of thought.
Well, it's a very interesting question, but the truth is, at the end of the day, that Netanyahu cannot function with a real right-wing conservative religious coalition. It's a coalition that will lead to further isolation in the international community, one that will move him further towards the extreme. We won't see any progress with the Palestinians, and I don't think he would even think about forming that kind of coalition. I agree with Hillary that he's going to try to attempt to bring in at least one, if not two, centrist parties, and kind of have a status quo coalition like he's had for the past 4 years, which, to say the truth, hasn't done too much.
Well, Leo, there's a couple of points mentioned here that our tweeters are commenting on. Michael says, the more anti-Israel the Middle East becomes, the bigger the hardline right-wing candidate has for chances of winning. That's a point that was recently just echoed. But James Brownstow on Twitter chimes in and he says, and the further to the right that Israel drifts, the more anti-Israel the Middle East becomes. Now, this is something that Lisa and I talked about at the very beginning of the show, this vicious cycle. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, elaborate on this cycle of events, and is there any way out of it?
Well, I think that's actually a very simple question. I think if you act crazy, then people are going to just step away, and people are going to be, increasingly unwilling to work with you. I think that applies not only for the Middle East, that applies also for the Obama administration, that applies also for Europe. But one thing I would like to say, I really agree with Ms. Hassan, who said before, this distinction between left and right-wing parties in Israel is really something we should be very, very careful about. I don't think, you could seriously say that Labour or Kadima or Yair Lapid's new party, which appears to be the winner in the polls, are in any term serious left-wing parties. At best, they're centrist. So I think really what we're seeing, despite their rise, I think we're seeing sort of a redefinition of what the center in Israeli politics means, and that to me is the biggest story.
Hillary, is it unreasonable or is it crazy, though, for Israelis to be conservative, to be voting more conservatively perhaps than they have in the past? I mean, clearly they don't see it the same way, that Liel does.
Well, I think from an internal Israeli perspective, when you talk about further isolation of Israel internationally, Israel feels very isolated. The Palestinians just went to the UN, and almost every country there recognized sort of non-member Palestinian state. It was a little bit of a vague formulation, but the point is they were endorsing Palestinians creating a state unilaterally without having to sit at the table and negotiate a peace deal with Israel. It was something that actually violated the Oslo Accords, but lots of people around the world still supported it. And you also have a sense of security isolation, that Israel, for instance, got out of Gaza, and the result has been rockets, basically, pounding away at the life of people in southern Israel. So when you're faced with that kind of insecurity, and you're in a situation where you're not feeling that the international community is so understanding of your situation, a lot of Israelis don't really think that it's in really their best interest to try and make further compromise or sacrifice, giving up more territory to try and please an international world that's not going to be sympathetic regardless of what they do. There's sort of a giving up of the sense that they could really be understood internationally.
Well, you mentioned rocket fire into southern Israel. John E. Mudd says the perception by the Israeli voter that Palestinians want to wipe them out, not compromise, are behind the rise of the political right in Israel. But George, there's another tweet here from Saif, and he says, as history shows, if you start a war with Gaza before the elections, you scare the people into voting for you. I'd like your thoughts on that.
I'm not sure whether it worked. Perhaps Netanyahu wanted it to work this way. I think it ultimately backfired because ultimately, of course, there is no victor in war, but Netanyahu definitely didn't win the war against Palestinians. Palestinian resistance managed to do something that Netanyahu didn't expect, and it fought really hard. And Netanyahu couldn't win the war the way he probably wanted. I just wanted to point out something. I'm just astonished that the issues, Palestinian issues, were not brought at all while we are discussing the Israeli elections. And it says a lot. It says a lot about the Israeli public that, it's not just, that let's ignore Palestinian issues. It's an occupation state. It said that it's colonizing people, occupying people, and the fact that the elections have passed, and we have just avoided completely to talk about Palestinians who are besieged in the Gaza Strip by Israel, who are denied basic rights and ruled militarily by Israel, and denied their rights in the West Bank.
I'm going to have to stop you there because we're out of time. Of course, stay tuned to Al Jazeera English for all of the latest election results on the Israeli elections. Hillary, Ilan, Badur, and everyone in our Google Plus Hangout, thanks for joining us today. Now, tomorrow, we ask the question, is it okay to be single after 27? In some cultures, it's taboo, but in China and India, more women are choosing to pursue their own future rather than a marriage. Send us your thoughts and your questions on that. And until tomorrow, we'll see you online.